Chapter 7, Control and Coordination, presented by Fatima Convent High School, E-Biology class, myself, Dipali. Now let us understand reflex arch in this topic. What happens in a reflex action? What is the meaning of word reflex? Now the word reflex action means the action is involuntary instant action without the involvement of brain for bringing about important reactions needed for survival. So we know that a reflex action is something spontaneously reacted to any of the stimuli given from the nature. The examples of reflex action are all around us, like the removal or withdrawal of hand or leg when anything sharp or hot touches unknowingly, coughing, sneezing, yawning, knee jerk response, movement of diaphragm, contraction of pupil in bright light, mouth starts watering when smell or sight of various delicious food is there. So, these all are called as reflexes. And the arch, that is a connection between the input sensory nerves and the output motor nerves along with spinal cord, is called as reflex arch. So let us see this in detail now. Reflex is a word we use very commonly when we talk about some sudden action in response to something in the environment. So the word reflex is a sudden action or sudden response. We say I jumped out of the way of the bus reflexly, or I pulled my hand back from the flame reflexly, or I was hungry, my mouth started watering reflexly. I gave you certain examples of reflex actions. So what exactly do we mean by this? A common idea is all such example is that we do something without thinking about it or without feeling in control of our reaction. Yet these are situations where we are responding with some action to change in our environment. How is control and coordination achieved in such situation? Before that, let us understand what is thinking. Now we all know that the human beings are the only organism who has the ability to think. Thinking is a complex activity and is bound to involve a complicated interaction of many nerve impulses from many neurons. Thinking centers are located in the forebrain. It receives signal from sensory nerves from various parts of the body. Thinking center analyzes the signal and prepares the instructions. From brain, instructions are transmitted to the effector organs through nerve motors. It may take more time to respond. Whereas in reflex action, instruction is generally given by spinal cord. So the time to transmit impulse from the organ to the brain and from brain back to the organ is saved in reflex action. That is why we give slow response when thinking is involved. So, the normal pathway for transmission of any signal or response is from the sensory organs to the brain and brain to the motor nerves. But the pathway for a reflex action is different and shorter. So, we can say that, let us consider this further. Take one of our example. Touching a flame is an urgent and dangerous situation for us, or in fact for any animal. How would we respond to this? One seemingly simple way is to think consciously about the pain and the responsibility of getting hurt and therefore move your hand. An important question then is, how long will it take us to think all this? The answer depends on how we think. If nerve impulses are sent around the way we have talked about earlier, that is the long path from the sensory nerves to the spinal cord to the brain to the motor cells to the spinal cord and back to the organ. So, the thinking would take lots of time. Then thinking is also likely to involve creation of such impulses. Thinking is a complex activity, so it is bound to involve complicated interaction of many nerve impulses from many neurons. If this is the case, it is no surprise that thinking tissue in our body consists of dense network of intricately arranged neurons. It sits in the forward end of the skull, receives signal from all over the body, which it thinks about before responding to them. Obviously, in order to receive these signals, this thinking part of the brain in the skull must be connected to nerves coming from various parts of the body. Similarly, if this part of the brain is to instruct muscles to move, nerve must carry this signal back to different parts of the body. If all this is to be done when we touch the hot object, it may take enough time for us to get burned. So, do you understand? Thinking is a long process involving longer time period and longer pathway. But what about this problem which has arisen due to the flame in front of us or any such actions which requires a very quick response? How does the design of the body solve this problem? Rather than having to think about the sensation of heat, if the nerves that detect heat were to be connected to the nerves that move muscles in a simpler way, the process of detecting the signal or the input and responding to it by an output action might be completed quickly. Such a connection is called as reflex arch. So, the arch which is formed by the connection of the sensory and the motor nerves that passes through the spinal cord forms an arch, which can be seen in the figure here. This is what is a reflex arch, where the receptor of heat and pain receptors in the skin are carrying the message to the sensory neurons and only to the spinal cord. After it reaches the spinal cord, it comes back immediately to the motor nerves and to the muscles to contract so that our hand is pulled back. Here the involvement of brain is almost negligible, and so this type of a short pathway is called as reflex arch. Where should such arch connect be made between the input and the output nerves? The best place, of course, would be at the point where they first meet each other. Nerves from all over the body meet in a bundle in a spinal cord on their way to the brain. And then the spinal cord carries the message to the brain. But here, in the reflex arch, is formed in this spinal cord itself, although the information input also goes on to reach the brain. But before the brain could signal, the spinal cord already signals the muscle. And so the involvement of brain is very little here. Of course, reflex arch have evolved in animals because the thinking process of brain is not so fast enough. In fact, many animals have very little or none of the complex neuron network needed for thinking. So it is quite likely that the reflex arch have evolved as efficient way of functioning in the absence of true thought process. However, even after complex neurons networks have come into existence, reflex arch continued to be more efficient for quick responses. Can you now trace the sequence of the event which occurs when a bright light is focused on your eyes? Very clearly, you can say it from this flow chart. So we know that the stimulus, maybe it is heat. In this question, it is light. It passes on to the receptor organ. If it is heat, it would be skin, and if it is light, it would be eyes. Then it passes to sensory fibers. From there, it will move to the spinal cord, where you have the sensory center as well as motor nerves. Sensory centers and motor nerves or motor centers. From this, it will pass to the motor nerve fibers. And then to the effector organ, which would be in first case muscles of hand, and in second case it would be eyes, and then the response, that is withdrawal of the hand or closing of the eyes. Is this very clear to you? So this is what is reflex arch and reflex action, which are very important. So thus, a neural pathway for the sensory and motor nerves that passes through the spinal cord from the reflex arch. A very speedy response is shown through this. The following examples are clearly telling us the meaning of reflex arch. Suppose by mistake and unknowingly we touch a hot object, then our hand is pulled back and we are able to save our hand from getting burnt. This is an example of a reflex arch. Now, why these animals have reflex arch? Because the thinking process of brain is not very fast enough, and many animals are very little or none of the complex neuron network, and because of that this reflex arch has evolved. But even if these complex neurons have developed now, the reflex arch is still functioning. Is this very much clear to you? Thank you for now. Next we will be studying about human brain.